So welcome to this afternoon's training session, which is going to consider how your church building can have a positive impact on the environment. And I'm so glad to welcome so many of you to the session. I'm Janet Edmond. I'm a member of the stewardship team, if you haven't met me before, and I'm joined on the webinar today by Stephen Craven. Stephen can wave, that's right, and Jemima Parker. And Stephen is a church building support officer within the DAC team. Jemima is a diocesan environment officer, and both Jemima and Stephen are going to be doing or delivering the most of the presentation today. There's going to be an opportunity to ask questions via the chat function. So if you all know where the chat function is, it's at the bottom of your screen. There's a little icon saying chat. If you want to type your questions in there as we go along, we'll pick the questions up at the end, although we will have a short break in the session after the first two topics, just to pick up any questions then, but otherwise we'll ask at the end. The session is going to be recorded today, so if you could, once I share my screen with you for the presentation, if you'd like to switch your cameras off and your microphones off, that would be appreciated. And don't worry about copying notes down, because we will we'll put a copy of the presentation slides onto the diocesan website, and I'll give you links for where that will be. And there will also be a recording on there as well. If you would like me to email you a copy of the presentation slides after the session, I can do that, but could I ask you to put your name and email address in the chat function and just send it to me? There's a drop-down list in there, and you can pick the person you want to send the information to. So if you do that, I can email you the presentation slides directly. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to share my screen with you now. And as I say, welcome to today's session. This is actually the fourth session in our series of maintenance training sessions, which we've been doing this spring. The other three sessions have, the first two sessions were recorded, and the slide presentations are available on the website, and the link is at the bottom of the page. The health and safety one, the slides are available as well, and you can access that by the link at the bottom of the page there. And this is today's agenda. We're going to have the first couple of topics, and then we're going to have a short break for questions, as I said, if there are any questions, and then we'll go on to the other sections, and then questions and answers at the end. And also, Jemima is going to be doing a poll through the session, a couple of polls, I should say, where she's going to be asking you a question that you can answer on the poll, so that you don't get a surprise. That is going to be happening during today's session. So I'm pleased now to hand over to Jemima, who's going to talk about our diocese's, or the Church of England's, I should say, target for reaching net zero in 2030.
Hi everyone, really good to be with you, and thank you for joining today. I just want to give you a little bit of background to start with, in terms of the net zero ambition from the Church of England. You may be aware that last February 2020, the General Synod of the Church of England recognised that there was a climate emergency and committed for the Church of England as a whole to be net zero by 2030. And of course that means that there's a call for all of us, every church, every diocese, to reduce our emissions right down to net zero. And I just wanted to start by asking you, really, how do you feel about that call? How does that make you feel? And I'm just going to launch a little poll to get your feelings on this. So there's some feelings there, and you can tick on the ones that you are experiencing. Are you feeling excited, challenged, pleased, resigned, annoyed? You can have more than one if you want to, because it's quite possible to feel excited but challenged, or several different emotions at once. So thank you, those of you who are filling that in already. That's brilliant. Just give your views on how you're feeling. So just clicking on your views, I'll just give you a moment or two more just to fill those in, because I can see some people are still adding their views. Fantastic. Right, I'll share the results with you, and you can see quite a lot of us are feeling challenged by this ambitious target from the Church of England, and it's great that many of you are feeling pleased that this is the right direction. It really does feel like it's a prophetic move from the Church of England. It's a way in which we can lead, and I'm really encouraged that some of you are feeling quite excited about this, but I do acknowledge that some of you are feeling frustrated and resigned to this, and annoyed a little bit as well. So I hope that during the course of the webinar today, we can help you with some of those feelings, and we'll feel perhaps a little less daunted by this by the end, as we look at how our buildings can play a part in meeting that target. So what are we trying to measure for this net zero target? If we could have the next slide, please, Janet. What's actually in this measurement? Because if we're aiming at net zero, we need to know what we're going to be trying to measure. And essentially, it is just what are called scope 1 and 2 emissions. That means the energy from our buildings, so your electricity, gas or oil or other fuels, and for the wider church, that means this are for our church schools, our clergy housing, and our diocesan offices. And obviously that's just for those of you from churches, that's just from our church buildings. And it's also the fuel use from our travel, our reclaimable travel for what we're calling ministerial miles. So not all the travel from the congregation coming to and from church, but for our clergy or other volunteers who reclaim their mileage. The target doesn't at the moment include building projects, church procurement, and a whole raft of other things that you can see there. That's partly because those are all included in scope 3 emissions, which are a kind of another step up, and it's partly because actually practically it's really hard to measure those. We don't really have a good way of measuring those for churches yet, and it's possible that as we go on this journey towards 2030, those may start to be included as we get to grips with how we can measure the carbon emissions from those things. So if we have next slide, Janet, please. What do we actually mean by net carbon emissions? What's this net bit got to do with it? So to get to your net emissions, we do a little sum. Basically, we take the energy from our buildings, our oil, gas and electricity use, and we add that to our reimbursable travel carbon, and that gives us our gross carbon footprint. And then we take away any electricity that's been generated renewably and any carbon offsets that your church may be paying for. So if you have 100% renewable electricity tariff, you can take off that electricity from your carbon calculations. If you're with the Green Journey scheme and you have carbon offset gas, you can take off those carbon emissions as well. And that gives us our net carbon emissions. So if we go to the next slide, where do most of our emissions come from? And I've had the joyous job of calculating the carbon emissions for the diocese, or estimating them as best as we can. And you'll see there that about a quarter of our emissions come from our schools, a quarter from our clergy properties, and nearly a half from our church buildings. So we are really keen for everybody with a church building who's looking after a church building to understand where their carbon emissions are coming from and how we can work together to reduce those. So I want to just take you through some simple first steps. And if we go on to the next slide, the first thing on these 5 first steps is to direct you to a little document called the Practical Path to Net Zero. And this is a national Church of England document which is based on some research from a series of energy audits from churches around the country, and it gives you a pathway through the actions to take to reduce your carbon emissions. And they start with really simple things that every church can do, and then move on to the more complicated things to do if you have the opportunity or if you have the funds. So I would really recommend this little document to you. And as Janet said, the web link is there on the slide. And when you receive the slides, you'll be able to pick that up and have a look at it. The next thing is to actually measure your carbon emissions. And many of you will have done the energy footprinting tool, use the energy footprinting tool, which is part of the online parish returns. And last year, for the first time, as part of the online parish returns, there was a section called the energy footprinting tool. And we're really delighted that over half of our churches in the diocese use this. And so you may already have received a report like the one you can see there on the left, which tells you what your carbon emissions are from your energy use. And that national tool is going to be developed so that it includes car mileage as well, travel mileage, and you'll be able to start calculating your emissions from your ministerial miles as well. You may want to go into more detail on what your carbon footprint is like. And so you could use the 360 Carbon, which is a carbon calculator hosted on the Climate Stewards website. And this goes into more detail looking at not just the energy and the travel for your church, but also looks at your waste, your food, if you're serving food on as part of your ministry, and a whole range of things. So it gives you a much more in-depth look at your carbon emissions. So top tip here is just to make sure that whoever does your online parish returns actually completes the energy footprinting tool this year. That would be really helpful. The third thing is good maintenance, and I'm not going to spend long on this, because actually if you've been attending the other webinars in this series, there's some fantastic advice in terms of how you can maintain your church building. But essentially the key point is that you can reduce your emissions by having a well-maintained church. If you think about it, a damp church with drafts or other issues is much harder to heat. And heating is a major part of our carbon emissions. It's probably about, for most churches, about 85% of their energy use comes from their heating, with electricity for lighting and appliances probably only about 15%. But moving on to the next slide, that electricity is important, and it's one of the quick wins in terms of reducing our carbon emissions. So you can switch to a renewable electric tariff relatively easily. As I say, here are the proportions of your electricity, gas or oil. This is for the churches in our diocese, using the data that we have available to us. You can see, as I say, that the electricity there can be up to 20. So I think we've got 21% there on this from this data, and that can be immediately taken off your carbon accounting if you switch to 100% renewable package. And if we have the next slide, we have a partnership with a company who offer the Green Journey package for us in the diocese, and they provide a switching service, and they provide a account management service, and they will help you with that process. The Green Journey also provide energy audits, and we go to the last of the 5 tips would be to engage in having an energy audit. And these audits are where an auditor comes to your church, takes a look around the buildings, and assesses your energy use, makes you suggestions as to how you could reduce your energy use, or how you could generate a renewable electricity, and this gives you a real insight into the steps that you could take. You can get a independent auditor in, or you could work through the Green Journey scheme, as we have negotiated complementary energy audits for all our churches through the Green Journey scheme. Stephen, I think, is going to mention energy audits in detail more, so I will stop there and hand over to Stephen.
Yes, so good afternoon, everyone, and I'm going to take you through some of these environmental principles, and also after that we're going to look at some case studies. So these guiding principles are something that the DAC, supported by its specialist advisors, has been developing for the last year or so. They're not yet fully finalised and published, but what you see today will be something quite close to the final version. And I can't go into the full detail of those documents in the short time available today. We also won't be covering all of these today, so we're not going to look at all at transport and access, and only very briefly at churchyards and water. So I'm going to focus on the ones for building materials, heating, lighting, and renewable energy. Next, please. So building materials. The idea here is to encourage PCCs to use sustainable materials, and that's under 3 headings. One is about the sourcing of materials. So it might be looking at the ethics behind some materials, particularly things like imported stone and slate. There's concern about the type of labour that's used in certain countries. Locally sourced, so that's trying to reduce the transport miles involved where materials come from the other side of the world. So the way the world economy works, it's often cheaper to buy things from China or India than from Britain, but that's not the best for the environment. Reclaimed materials, such as the example here, where recycled plastic has been used to make a bench that looks like a wooden one, but will probably last longer, and it's saved that plastic from going into landfill. And then thirdly, minimal emissions in the production process. I'll look at that a bit more in a later slide. Next, thank you. So heating, that's what we're going to focus most on today. Jemima's already talked about reducing your heat loss. You do need to take expert advice on this, because whereas things such as insulating your building and putting double glazing in might sound like good ideas and might well be in a modern building, they're often not appropriate for older buildings. So do talk to your architect or some other professional if you want to go down that route. Using sustainable sources of fuel, we've already mentioned, going on to green electricity tariffs, certainly moving away from oil where possible, and to use the controls of your heating system to minimize the amount of energy you actually use. So that might be having different heating zones for different parts of your building, rather than heat the whole building every time, or having smart controls which only come on to meet an immediate demand, rather than at the same time every day, irrespective of the weather, that sort of thing. Next. When it comes to lighting, we're encouraging people to look at energy efficient fittings. Usually that will mean LED on a new installation. For older light fittings, but you might still have to use the compact fluorescent types, but do be aware that some of these low energy bulbs produce a very harsh white light, which might not be the most appropriate for something like a church building. A warmer colour of light is usually better. And again, smart controls so that you're only lighting those parts of the building that are actually needed. When it comes to external floodlighting, there's a downside to that, not only in that floodlights tend to use a lot more energy than internal lights because they're having to light a large area against a dark background at night, but also they can impact on local wildlife. If you've got bats or owls in the area, they can be affected. And then there's a whole question of light pollution, of lights that are shining upwards, preventing other people from appreciating the night sky, that kind of thing. So we would encourage for external lighting, the DAC will be looking at how the balance of the additional energy use and impact on the environment weighs against the public benefit of perhaps safety in the churchyard or drawing attention to your building. So again, that's something we need to look at carefully. The next one is churchyards. We did have a whole day conference 2 years ago about this at Headingley. Some of you might have come to that. And the presentations from that are still available on the DAC page on the website. So I'm not going to talk about that in detail, but that's worth looking at in terms of biodiversity. When it comes to trees, we're encouraging parishes to do all they can to maintain their churchyard trees as long as possible, not to fell them just because a tree might be starting to push a wall out of alignment or because someone thinks it might be dangerous. Very often a tree can be managed to remain safe for a long time. So we do need to look carefully at those sort of situations, and also to look ahead on towards the age of trees, those that might need to be removed because they have come to the end of their natural life in future years. So rather than waiting till a tree is actually about to fall because it's dead, get a professional survey to assess the age of the trees in your churchyard, look at how much longer they might have to live, and start planting now to replace ones that will have to be removed in future. And where a tree does have to be removed, we encourage 3-for-1 planting to increase the churchyard cover or contributing to a planting scheme elsewhere. And then finally, for hard standing areas and paths, there's a preference for permeable materials such as loose gravel or bound gravel rather than hard surfaces. Where hard surfaces are necessary, perhaps for wheelchair access, then natural stone will be preferred to tarmac. Water management, so that's about minimising the use of treated mains water, which is actually quite expensive and does have an environmental impact in being stored, treated and pumped around. We've talked in previous maintenance sessions about the importance of having adequate gutters and downpipes on your church to shed water away from the building. Those gutters that take the rainwater away can also be used to capture it for use as grey water for things like flushing toilets and watering the churchyard in summer. Surface water drainage, rainwater in other words, should ideally go to a soak away in the churchyard if that's possible, rather than going into the public drains. And foul drainage, sewerage in other words, if there is no main sewerage available, then an alternative to traditional septic tanks is the trench arch. You can see one being built here, which is a way of naturally treating the sewage within your churchyard underground, and that's been used in a few churches in our diocese already. We can supply details of that. So Jemima's already talked about energy audits, so I'm just going to say a little bit about what you might find in an energy audit report. One of the things they will help you assess is whether the capacity of your boiler, the heat output of the radiators, and the heat loss of the building to the atmosphere are more or less the same, which they should be ideally. It's quite common, though, to find older systems where the boiler is more than capable of matching the heat loss of a building in all but the coldest weather, but the heat output that radiators can manage is much less. So the boiler is not being used efficiently. But again, your audit will help you to balance those figures. The question of heating people or space, I'll come on to that with some of the case studies later. But basically, some of the if you're using something like a blown hot air system or older style radiators, they are tending to heat the air. Some of the newer technology is more about heating people. Reducing heat loss is always essential. We would encourage you to do what you can to reduce heat loss from your building and drafts coming into it before installing a new heating system. But not all forms of insulation are suitable for all buildings. So again, do take professional advice on that. Proportionate energy use, the figures might be quoted in your audit in kilowatt hours per person hour. So we're not trying to expect a church that has 100 people using a building 5 times a week will not be expected to cut their energy use to the same level as one that only has 30 people meeting on a Sunday. So that person hour measure is a useful way of sort of normalizing the energy use and seeing what is efficient and what isn't. Next. So some ways that you can reduce energy use before you start thinking about what heating system you should have. One is to insulate pipes that aren't actually being used to distribute heat into the meeting areas of the building. So in boiler rooms or under the floor or anywhere like that, the pipes should be well insulated. Zone the heat so that you're only turning on the radiators or other heaters in the parts of the building being used. Timing. Rather than have it the heating on right up to the end of the service, you might well find, if your building is well insulated, that you can just have the heating on for an hour or two before the service and then switch it off at the start of the service, and the building will stay warm enough through the meeting. Infrared heaters, these are one of the newer technologies, and they do warm people or seats or other fabric rather than the air. And particularly for smaller congregations and smaller buildings, they are often an efficient solution, as are under pew heaters, and we'll look at an example of those in more detail later. Destratification fans are often suggested, so that's about pushing the hot air that's risen to the top of the building down towards the bottom where people are actually meeting. And there's a mixed message on those. In some cases, they've been found to work quite well. Other churches have installed them and found they actually make little difference. So again, you need to take expert advice before considering that kind of option. And the DAC does have 2 heating advisors at present who can help you look at options, but they are quite busy at the moment because of the press towards carbon reduction. We are getting a lot of requests for their advice, so you might need to be patient. And then when you've done all that, we're looking at offsetting remaining energy use to get to net zero. So the 2 main ways of doing that is making sure any electricity you're using is 100% renewable. There's a picture there that I took last week of a huge solar farm near Wakefield, which is being doubled in capacity at the moment. It's going to have, I think, something like 40,000 solar panels when it's complete. And the other way is to offset the remaining carbon dioxide produced, for example, by burning gas, by investing in tree planting, probably through some kind of sustainability scheme in this country or elsewhere, because it's a global issue. It doesn't matter if the trees are being planted somewhere else rather than in your locality, it will still help. So a few case studies. This one at Markington, and I do have some more photographs and some more detailed information about this and some of the other case studies, so just ask me if you're interested, and we can share a bit more information when we put these slides out on the website afterwards as well. So they previously had a 41 kilowatt boiler, which was actually far more than the few large diameter pipes that were in the church were capable of actually putting out. So it was a very inefficient system. The new system they have is based on an individual electric heater under every seat. And that's still only the same heat output that they had before, 14 kilowatts. But because the heat is immediately under the person being heated, that is sufficient for people to feel comfortable during the service. You're not trying to heat the whole building. So that works for small buildings with only infrequent meetings. It's not suitable for a large or a building that's used every day. The next one is a Methodist church with a fairly modern building, and they've chosen to go for these far infrared heating panels. The far infrared means that it's the energy wavelength of the light that it puts out is actually well beyond the visible range. So it doesn't look to be glowing, but it is actually putting out radiant energy which heats people where it reaches them. However, the energy is quite short range, so this is only suitable if you've got a building where the seats are quite close to the wall or quite close to wherever the heating panels can be put. And they've used a combination of hot panels higher up where they're out of harm's way, and cooler ones at 40 degrees where they're lower down where people could accidentally touch them. And the good thing here is you don't need a specialist contractor. Any qualified electrician can install electric panels like these, but they do have a higher running cost than a gas system. So it's an investment in sustainable energy, not a cost saving. But do also take a look at the link that was at the bottom of that page, the case study of their specially built church hall, which is said to be Britain's first carbon neutral one. Another option is air source heat pumps. These work best with underfloor heating or some other situation where a building is being used regularly every day. They're not suitable for, again, occasional Sunday-only use. These were installed about 15 years ago when the church was reordered, and then since then they've put another extension on, which has actually virtually hidden the extractor fans, which are actually just at the bottom of the gable of that transept above the new extension. You can hardly see them there. I have now received some information about the capital and running costs of that project if anyone's interested, but it's given them a nice warm church and hall with net zero heating system. Another example we were sent was from Christchurch, Darley. Now, they looked at having ground source heating that wasn't suitable for their church building because that is only used once a week, and so it wasn't a suitable system, but they have a church hall which is used every day. So the ground source heating was appropriate for that, to put underfloor heating in the church hall. What they found though, and there's a lot of people have found, is that grant funders are reluctant to give to religious organisations. What they had to do was set up the church hall as a community centre with independent trustees, even although the building is still owned by the PCC, and then they were able to access community funding. They also found that they need a few electric heaters for a quick boost to the heat in particularly cold weather. But what they did do with the church building was to renew the fan heaters and put double glazing and wall insulation in, so they minimise their electricity use. And all that only cost £20,000, most of which was funded through grants, but it would cost more now. That was 2007 prices. I should mention that most of these buildings we've looked at so far have been unlisted or at most grade 2 listed. If you've got a grade 1 or 2 star building, we do need to consider the visual impact of new technologies more carefully. This is one of the latest case studies we've got. It's being installed at the moment. They're going from an oil boiler to a biomass boiler, initially using the same radiators, although they might need to replace or increase the number of those as a later phase of work. They'll see how it goes. The capital cost was 21,000 plus VAT. About a quarter of that they're getting grant funding for, but they will save £1,000 a year on running cost. And so the system will actually pay back for itself within 10 years, as well as saving 11 tonnes a year of carbon dioxide as they move away from oil. So we look forward to seeing how that goes. And finally, this is a bit of a cautionary tale. This church in the far north of our diocese was one of the early adopters of biomass. They were approached by a company who are installing a community system that also serves the pub and many of the houses in the village. The good news was the PCC wasn't asked to pay anything to the capital cost of installing this, And another good thing is that it is very locally sourced fuel. They're using wood chip from a large privately owned estate nearby. So it's a very sustainable system. The downside is that they had to agree to pay a fixed proportion of the running cost of the whole system. And that is costing them £2,000 a year, whereas before it was only costing them £400 a year for oil to heat the building once a week for a service. So in effect, the PCC is subsidising the renewable energy to the rest of the community. And they weren't really prepared for that. So the lesson there is to look at the finances long term very carefully if you're approached with a view to this sort of project. And the next one. So having looked at some of those heating studies, we'll just say a little bit more about lighting to reduce energy use. So LED is the new standard. We wouldn't really expect anything other than that for a new installation these days. The talk has also moved away from the wattage power of lighting through lumens, which is the amount of light that is actually being put out by the bulbs. We're now thinking more in terms of lux, which is the amount of light which actually reaches where it's being used. So is there enough light to read the service book in the pews? Is there enough light on the walls to read the posters and memorials and displays around the edge of the church? Is there enough light in the chancel to see what the service leaders are doing? So it's about illuminating where things are actually happening rather than just flooding the building with light. And that's usually achieved by a combination of downlights, uplights, and spotlights to highlight particular features. That kind of system really needs to be designed by an expert, either a lighting consultant or some architects, not all, but some church architects are quite proficient at that sort of thing. They also need to have electronic controls so that you can have different scenes of lighting for different types of meeting or different types of service. Your main family service on a Sunday will probably need more light than a reflective service in Advent, for example. If you've got an open church, one that's left open for people to visit during the day, it's worth having a movement sensor so that the lights only come on when someone enters the building or is moving around and for a few minutes afterwards, rather than the whole day. And we've already mentioned floodlights. If you want to floodlight the building, consider just highlighting features such as perhaps the clock or the entrance for windows and so on, rather than the whole building. And then finally, in this section, environmental impact of materials. We've already mentioned that in the DAC principles. Natural materials are generally better. They have less embedded carbon dioxide in them and may often last longer. Particular word about PVC. Not only is PVC a form of plastic, and we all know about the plastic getting into the ocean and that sort of thing, but also it produces a lot of pollution in the production process, and PVC only really lasts perhaps about 30 years, whereas metal or timber, if they're regularly painted, will last much longer. And some metals such as aluminium don't really need painting at all. If you're considering a new build or an extension, that's really the chance to think outside the box and look at opportunities to innovate. Some of the examples that other churches have taken on board with their new buildings are straw bale walls, timber framing, and solar slates on the roof. So that can be a really exciting opportunity to be very environmentally friendly if you're going to extend or replace your building. So I think we're going to hand back to Jemima now for the next section.
Thank you, Stephen. I just want to give you a short section on renewable energy generation. And I will keep this short because we've already had a lot of content today. And I'm conscious that one of the key things for generating your electricity is actually that before you consider this, you really need to think about reducing any energy waste, and that old adage, insulate before you generate. And I appreciate for many churches it's inappropriate or impossible to insulate the roof, but just that thought of actually saving and reducing on your energy before you start thinking about generating electricity. And when we think of energy generation, we tend to think of solar, and that's probably going to be one of the ways in which, as church buildings, we can generate electricity most easily, although it might be in an appropriate location possible to generate electricity with a small wind turbine, or with a hydro scheme if your church is in the right location. And solar is always a very kind of seems to be a very attractive option. It's what I like to call eco bling, because it's the sort of visible way of showing that we're caring for creation, and our church is being progressive, which is great. It's a good way to signal that to the community. But as I say, you need to be thinking very carefully about whether it's right for your church. And the first question really is to think about, how are you going to use that electricity? What's the purpose of generating that electricity? And generally, churches don't use that much electricity during the day. Compared, say, to your church primary school or school that's next door to the church, churches don't have a lot of energy use during the daytime when electricity is going to be generated by solar. It might be that you want to generate electricity for your heating system, in which case you might be thinking about installing some form of storage, battery storage for that. And if you're thinking about an air source heat pump, or a ground source heat pump, then that electricity could be used to power those forms of heating. Equally, if you were thinking of car charging points, again, the electricity could be used for those. Sorry, if we could just go back a slide, Janet. Sorry, I jumped you on too quickly there. But I would really encourage you to develop a business plan if you were thinking about installing solar, so that you actually are looking at what the costs are going to be and who's going to be using the electricity. And then the second key question is your roof structurally sound? And I'd encourage you to talk to your architect and to get expert advice on whether your church roof is going to be suitable. Clearly, you can put ground-based solar somewhere in your churchyard if that's appropriate, but usually people are looking at their church roofs. So just to give you an example of a church that did install solar panels in 2014, St Matthew's in Bankfoot in Bradford installed 16 black panels. And here I was visiting on a snowy day, and actually there was still generation going on, because it doesn't have to be a bright sunny day, there just has to be light for solar to be generated, electricity to be generated from solar. At the time, back in 2014, this installation cost about £10,000, but the cost of solar panels has dropped significantly. And that's why the feed-in tariff payments, the subsidy from the government, have now been stopped. So there isn't that incentive, but the costs for installation are lower. So I would encourage you, as I say, to develop a business plan if you are looking at this. Then moving on to car charging points. Again, if you're thinking about this, I encourage you just to think through why you might install electric vehicle charging points. Usually they will not be used by your congregation, because your congregation probably are only traveling a small number of miles and they'll be charging their car at home. You might be installing them for people traveling from a long distance. If your church is used for lots of sort of, if you're used for conferences or something, or if you're in a tourist area, it might be used good for people traveling a long distance. But otherwise, you might be thinking about having those car charging points for your community who may not have off-street parking where they can charge their own cars. So again, several things to think through, and I would encourage you to watch the Church of England webinar on this topic to go into more details. And then I just wanted to mention to you, we have 4 really exciting projects running in the diocese who have received Rural Community Energy Fund money in order to scope out renewable energy generation. And a couple of these are clusters of churches where they're scoping out how they can have renewable heating systems and generate energy to heat and light their churches. And a couple of them, St James Wetherby and Holy Trinity Ripon, are looking at community projects where it's the church and other community buildings around. And we're really hoping that these projects, which will be running this year, will have learning points for all of us going forward in terms of how we can move to renewable sources of energy and power. So lastly from me, just to say, please do draw on the Church of England guidance and the webinars that are available. There are some fabulous webinar topics, everything, as I say, from car charging points through lighting, how you get a team together to work on this, and on when you should replace your heating, if you should replace your heating, different heating types, all sorts of things. And guidance, which comes in the form of a series of rather nice diagrams, and you click on them to find the guidance hidden behind on different topics. Before I hand over to Janet to talk about funding, I'm just going to give you another little poll, and it'd be really good to hear how possible you feel it would be for your church to become net zero carbon. So please do just put in your views, just give you one answer. Whether you think it's going to be really easy, it's going to be hard, it's going to be impossible. Just pop on your choices there. That would be great, just for us to see how you're feeling this might be going forward. Super, thank you. So large number of you responded, thank you. Just give you a moment to finish there. Super, I'll stop it there and I'll share the results with you. I can see that, yes, quite a few of you feel this is going to be very challenging going forward. It's lovely to see a few people thinking that this is going to be easy, and I'm very conscious that others will feel strongly that this isn't going to be possible in your building and your circumstances. I'm going to hand over to Janet, because I hope that what she has to say about funding might encourage you.
Thanks, Jemima. Yes, I wish I had something really encouraging to say about funding. Unfortunately, as with all of these things, money is a really important thing here. The finances to actually make these changes are important. And at the moment, the financial side is kind of lagging behind a little bit. There aren't that many opportunities out there at present, although Jemima has mentioned the Rural Community Energy Fund, which has been really good in terms of giving that startup funding for those projects in the diocese. I'm just going to point you in the direction with very shortly, with time left, of some possible areas where you could look for funding and what's available. First of all, Church of England have the guide, the National List of Charitable Grants for Churches. It does have a section in there for green grants, and that's section 4. If you scroll down, you go to the page and this link here in Parish Resources and scroll down to section 4, you'll find the list of charitable grants. And then if you go to the Environmental and Sustainability Project section, you'll find a list in there of possible grant funders. A lot of them do give to nature conservation as well, rather than just renewable energy grants, but you just really need to keep checking what their criteria is. So that's one place you can look. And one of those funders who do fund churches, church buildings, is the Garfield Weston Foundation. They are very good. And they are one of the funders that I would suggest, approaching. And they do give capital funding for this type of thing. They do expect you, though, to have at least 50% of the funding already there as matching funding. So they won't fund 100%. But they are a very good funder, and they've been very generous to churches in the past. So do have a look at that one. Also, there's the Community Energy England website that you can have a look at. This, again, is an organisation that does help and helps to give the communities a voice, if you like, in this sector. And they like to fund community projects. So as Jemima and Stephen were saying earlier, it's best to try and look at these sorts of projects as having community benefit to really improve your chances of securing funding. And they have a lot of grants that come up, the latest grants page, if you like. So if you go to the website and you look at the news section and click on funding opportunities, it will take you to a page where all the latest funding opportunities are available. And again, there will be nature conservation funding opportunities there, but also renewable energy funding opportunities. Jemima mentioned that the Church of England were producing a number of webinars around guidance on renewable energy. And there is also going to be, I'm really glad to say, some webinars coming up in the autumn on the 7th of September and the 9th of September about funding and fundraising. The first one on the 7th, that's going to cover looking at the funding landscape for environmental projects and churches and the different types of funding that are available, trusts and foundations, statutory grants and loans, that sort of thing. So that's really worth going along to. It is a 1.5 hour webinar, so it's quite long, and there'll be more time for questions, but you can register for that webinar by the link at the bottom here. If you go to that page and just scroll down, you'll find these webinars on environmental fundraising. And the second webinar, which is going to be on the 9th of September, 2 days later, that's actually going to be, again, looking at churches, arts and heritage. It's looking at all sorts, really, but it's also going to be talking you through what the stages are for your planning, your fundraising strategy for your environmental project. So it's going into a little bit more detail about where you start, how you build up your project, and how you can put your case for support together when you're applying to funders. So I think definitely I'm looking forward to those 2 webinars to find out more about what funding is available. I really would advise you to register for those webinars. They're very good, and they will be recorded as well. So if you can't manage to get to them, the recording will be available afterwards. And I'm saving the best till last, of course. There is some funding available through our own diocese now, which will help in a small way with environmental projects for your churches. Now, this is the church building grants that we launched a month or so ago. And these grants are going to be available hopefully every year for the next 5 years. There's £80,000 a year that's available for these grants every year. And the money is actually coming from restricted funds that the diocese has, and they can only be spent really on the church building itself. dealing with the fabric of the building and any improvements to maintenance, that sort of thing. And it will also cover environmental improvements to the building, such as insulation, improvements to your heating, improvements to your lighting, as long as there is an environmental benefit there. And the closing date for the first round of grant applications is actually tomorrow, the 30th of April. But there are going to be another 2 funding rounds. You can find more details about this application, about the application form and the guidance on the grant. That's available at this link on the diocesan website. And I would really, you know, we've had, I think for tomorrow, I think we're probably going to have about 20 applications in altogether for this funding round. The next funding round, I think, is the end of June, and the next one after that, the end of October, I think, off the top of my head. So that is definitely worth having a look at. The application form's not that difficult to fill in, but you do have to, you know, you do have to demonstrate that your project is either about maintenance of the building or has a real environmental benefit. So definitely have a look at those. Sorry, that's a very quick run through questions, the funding section there, but I think we will go on to questions now. Before we do, these are our contact details. I think you probably all know us. There is going to be a recording of this webinar, and there will be a copy of the presentation slides available, which you can find at this link. I know that a lot of people have sent me their details in the chat function, which I now will email out details of the presentation slides. But for now, I'm going to stop sharing, and I think we can open the floor really to questions now.